Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Mariana Marriage and No Money session. This might be the untold story for some people. When I sat down to think about what I wanted to do for this session earlier in the year, I wasn't sure what topic I wanted to present. But over the last few years, I guess probably 2 years, I've seen some myths and assumptions and various judgments on why Mariana married. Did she have to marry? Did she only marry because she was greedy for money? Did she marry because she was worldly? All of these types of things. And it's very fascinating to see all of these discussions and to see where people are coming from when they, develop these stories for themselves. Because one of my favorite things about learning about these women are the various stories that we tell along the way. So we get to find these random bits of information and piece it together like a puzzle. And so along the way, we get to develop theories and connect with these women and these stories in, various ways that matter to us and that mean something to us. So in this session, I am not here to change people's opinions of their own stories of Mariana or stories that they've created based on the evidence they have or the things that they've read. But in this session, I do want to share some facts that will help people develop their story more or develop their determinations of Mariana and her family more. And I've said I think it actually came up in a water closet session earlier this weekend, that the research I do on Mariana and the Belcombes is not necessarily because I put them on an altar or I think they are absolutely amazing human beings. I just love that we know so much about them based on someone's journaling, that we get to also find all these connections and all of this pieces of information and create a story about these women and their brother that they span the LGBTQIA spectrum. And so it's just very interesting. And so I love diving deeper into the Belcombes and of course, Mariana. And so today's session is really just to provide some more information. And I'm going to focus on that myth that is quite often repeated, and I'm not quite sure where it originated from, but the assumption that Mariana's family had quite a bit of money and that she didn't need to marry to live comfortably, and that she might have married Charles for nefarious purposes. Of course, we're never going to know why she married, but there is evidence that exists that lends to the theory that her family did not have the money that might be assumed that they had, and she didn't have the money available to her when the time came to live comfortably. And so for the sake of time for this presentation, I'm not going to go into all the details around, what was expected of women at the time, and that women without money couldn't just get by like they can today, so to speak, and the societal rules beyond what most of us, depending on where we live, can even imagine. Like, I won't go into those details. You can find all of that from other sources. But as a baseline, we do know that for the most part, in order for women to survive, unless they were heiresses or owned property that was theirs, it was hard for them to get by in life. So I'm going to follow the family details and share some information that sheds light more on the life and the evolution of the Belcombes and maybe where their money was, where it went, where it didn't come from, etc. Okay, so I'm going to start with the making of Mariana. So just a quick overview. We've got her father, William Bulcock. Originally, he changed his name to Belcombe. That's a whole nother story. We've got Marian Mountford, which is Mrs. Belcombe, also Mrs. B. And we've got both of their parents, Dr. B's father, Henry Bulcock, and mother, Sarah Bulcock, and Marianne's parents, Edward and Anne. And then I also have included Dr. Belcombe's brother, Robert, and Marianne's half-brother, John Bly, who she actually lived with after her parents passed away. So these are some of the members that we've looked at to find and follow that money. And I'll come back to these people in a little bit, but just kind of setting that foundation for who we start looking at or who might be helpful to figure out, did Mariana really have a lot of money to depend on when she came of age? Our next family tree, of course, is the direct Belcombes. We've got Dr. Belcombe, Mrs. B, and the children. And remember, there are 5 daughters and 1 son. And so imagine, you can assume the son's going to go off and do things and have a job and make money and do all these wonderful things. But with being a woman, of course, you've only got a few options. And it's either live with your parents, marry somebody with money, or hope that your parents have a lot of money and property to give you. And so we'll look at each of these family members and sort of where they ended up on this money or no money spectrum, and why maybe the decisions that Mariana did make were good ones, so to speak, for her health and survival. Okay, so to start on this journey, I want to talk a little bit about before her marriage to Charles. So there is a social connection to the Lawtons before the 1814, 1816 timeframe that we know Anne mentions quite a bit in her journals. And in this presentation, I'm not like showing all of Anne's quotes. I'm focusing on the outside archival information that is available to tell the story, but I'll mention multiple times when we know that Anne talks about things that we can sort of use as our secondary reference to help either verify some of this information or expand upon it. So before Mariana married Charles, we are going to go to the Lawton area. And here in this picture, in this map, you can see we've got Lawton Hall here at the top. It's a very huge estate. Of course, we know this is where Charles was born and where he came from. And this is where Mariana ended up one day. So just south of that, we have a place called Linley Wood. And this was also a very well-to-do family. There's actually a lot of research about this family, which is very fascinating. They were into pottery, and there's just a lot of information out there. But I stumbled across this family because of the connection to Mariana and the Belcombes. So just to put this in reference, I just wanted to show you that it was a neighboring home and a well-to-do family nearby. So the family that lived at Linley Wood are known as the Caldwells, and it was passed through their family for generations and generations. Unfortunately, the house was torn down in the 1940s, I believe, late 40s, early 50s. And now there's like a golf course, and it's sold off into multiple properties, but the area is kind of still there. So in that family, there was multiple people living in the house. They had like 5 kids, but there's 3 I'm going to focus on. So James Caldwell was the patriarch of the family. His wife was Elizabeth, and one of their daughters was Anne Marsh. And the cool thing about this family is that they kept a journal. In fact, James Caldwell kept a detailed journal almost daily from his early adulthood all the way until he died in 1838. So this spans decades of content. And while it's not as detailed as Anne Lister's, he does provide what he did during the day, who he met with, and then if there's something important about that, he will sometimes note that. So it is a really good resource for who was doing what in the area. His daughter, Anne Marsh, also kept a journal, and hers was very straightforward. She literally just kept information on where she went, what she did, like had breakfast with my sister, had dinner with so-and-so, things like that. But this all helps to tell the story and piece together a broader picture of where the Belcombes were and what they were doing. Now, I'm going to move forward to 1812. And to set the stage, remember the significance of 1812. So of course, that's the year we know that Mariana and Anne Lister met. So Anne Lister and Mariana met that year. And that's when, of course, their relationship started to grow. We also know that that's the same year that Steph Belcombe, who also went to school to become a doctor. Remember, Mariana's brother. He graduated from the University of Edinburgh, and in June of 1812. And by July of 1812, he was already ensconced in the community of Lawton. And so we're going to see sort of how that plays out here. Of course, there's still holes in this, but knowing that Steph graduated in June, he's already well on his way with being in the social circles of the Lawton area in July of that same year. Either he already knew people at the time, or he just got really lucky. Maybe he moved there directly after graduation and started, networking. Now, we looking at Anne Marsh Caldwell's journal. She's got 5 really interesting entries. So 27th of July, 1812, she mentions Mr. and Mrs. Lawton. Now that would be Charles and his first wife, called with Dr. Belcombe for the first time. So that's where we know July 27th, Dr. Belcombe, Steph, was already such good friends with the Lawtons that they were taking him to social dinners with them, right? And as we know from Anne's trials and tribulations, taking somebody to dinner with you to somebody else's house was not necessarily an easy thing, nor was it a socially acceptable thing always. So that right there, that kind of tells you that either Steph knew these people ahead of time, or he did really well at networking and schmoozing with all of these people. So then we move into September 1812. Me, Elle, and I called upon Miss Belcombe at Lawton Hall. Now, Miss Belcombe, of course, we know at that time there's 4 of them, excuse me. Mrs. Milne had already married by then. So there is Nance, Mariana, Ellie, and Lou. It could be any 4 of those, but I am going to assume, it's my assumption, that this is referencing Mariana. We know that Mariana and Steph were very close. Steph named his daughter after Mariana. We know Ann Lister liked to take credit for that, but I don't know if it was actually all her doing, but Steph and Mariana were very close. So if we're assuming that this Miss Belcombe is Mariana, fast forward to October 13th, 1812, and the Lawtons, Miss Belcombe and Dr. Belcombe dined with us. Danced in the evening. Elizabeth and Sally Wedgwood came. The Wedgwoods, if you, Anne, I think, actually mentions them in future times because they became friends of Mariana's. So we see Miss Belcombe again in 1812. Now remember, the Lawtons, that's Anne Featherstone, Charles's first wife, and Charles. So I know some people might take this to be like, oh, immediately Mariana was trying to get her way in that early. That's the part, obviously, we don't know, right? We just know that she's with her brother, and her brother is introducing her to social circles. So, there are a lot of theories you can come up with from that, whether it's Steph was trying to, help secure something, not necessarily for Charles, right? Because Mrs. Lawton at the time died unexpectedly. So we can't, I guess, assume that it was for nefarious purposes. But fast forward to August 1813, on Monday, the Lawtons, Dr. Belcombe and Miss Thomason and Miss Belcombe called. So she's there again. And August 14th, 1813, Saturday, Mrs. Lawton, Miss Belcombe's, Dr. B came to dinner. I dined with my dear Mary. The Mary referenced here is Anne's sister. She died later that year. She was really sick. So that's not a reference to Mariana. So we've got 5 instances of information that says Mariana was socializing with the Lawtons as early as 1812. Same year she meets Anne. And Steph, obviously, he is working very hard at networking in this community. A lot of his activities with the Caldwells are trying to he's trying to set up medical centers. He's trying to set up book societies. He's trying to get people to invest in his business adventures. So, you can also think that, oh, maybe taking your sister around, who we know from Tibbs mentions in letters was the prettiest of the Belcombe sisters. Again, that's subjective, only based on a few comments in the journals and letters. But he could have been parading his sister around to see, because it wasn't just the Lawtons they were hanging out with. He was actually spending time with all of the most richest families in the area at that time. I'm gonna move forward on this timeline, and now we look at James Caldwell's journal entries. 26 October 1814, Mr. William Penlington breakfasted, and then he mentions intelligence of the death of Mrs. Charles Lawton. So for 2 whole years, again, like I said, Mariana, Steph, hanging out with everybody, and then Mrs. Lawton dies. The 29th of October 1814, he notes that he attended the funeral. And what's really cool here, which you don't always see, but he actually placed, the way he wrote it, he places who was holding the coffin where during the pallbearer time. So you can see the 6 people carrying it, and then he includes the clergy, medical people, and other people that were there at the funeral. So that's just an interesting piece. I had not seen that before in all of my funeral researching of people. So now we are at 1814. And we know, fast forward 2 years, and in 1816, Mariana and Charles marries. Now, one of the interesting things that after Mrs. Lawton died, there's no more entries from James Caldwell or his daughter mentioning a Miss Belcombe coming back to visit. So, there's, we don't know why that is. It could be that could have been looked upon badly socially if Dr. Belcombe is now taking his sister around again. But we do know, based on Anne's mentions, that there was still communication. We don't know necessarily for sure if it was Charles reaching out, if it was Steph trying to say, oh, hey, Charles, you're single now. My sister's over here. What do you think? We don't know. But we do know in 1816, Charles and Mariana married, and she goes to Lawton Hall to become Mrs. Lawton. And one would assume to be comfortable and to not have to worry about ever being homeless, or having to work for her money, or having to live in a small dingy apartment in York somewhere, right? Like that is what women did to make sure that they could be comfortable. Going forward. Okay, so now we are going to look for the money, right? If there is an assumption that Mariana already had money and that she didn't have to marry, well, let's take a minute to go and look and see where that money could have come from, or if there's any evidence of the physical existence of said money. Again, here's that family tree. As a quick reminder, we've got Papa B and Mama Belcombe, and her half-brother, and Dr. B's brother, and their parents. So we're going to look at Edward Mountford's will. We're going to look at John Bly's will. We're going to look at Dr. Belcombe and Mrs. Belcombe's will, as well as Robert Wilcox's will. All right, so Edward Mountford, her father. So his will is about 2 pages. And he was Mariana's father and was a career naval officer. So he was born in Benham, Norfolk in 1713 and died in Wickham, Hampshire in 1772. Sadly, he died when Mariana was only 12 years old. And unfortunately, some people called Mariana, Mrs. Belcombe, Marianne. Unfortunately, her mother had died when she was 8, and Marianne Belcombe was their only child. So in his will, of course, he leaves everything to his daughter. Now, one of the things to remember when we're looking at these wills is that oftentimes the very first part of a will that starts is, first, I will that all my just debts and funeral expenses shall be fully paid and satisfied. This is a very common entry. It takes different shapes and is worded differently, but most wills, the standard is to start off saying that whatever I have, take it and first pay my debts and take care of all my expenses. What is left over, then dispense as my will says. So I know sometimes that's easy to overlook. And one of the things that is unfortunate during this kind of research is we don't always know what sort of debts or expenses existed, right? We see this will that is made at any given time. They'll add, codicils on it, make changes, but we see a will based on a certain either amount of money or certain properties at any given time. And that's not always the case when that person dies, right? If you make your will today, 10 years from now, your life might look totally different. You might have sold properties. You might have got into debt. You might have more money than what you thought. And if you don't make those updates, or even if you do, it's not always detailed enough to understand that whole picture. So her father, he did add a codicil. So this will was dated 1770, and he added a codicil in 1771. So his will is very general. There is the only time he specifically speaks to something is the fact that he gives his freehold and copyholds to his daughter that exists within Benham and Hindringham in the county of Norfolk. So that's the only specifics he mentions. He does not mention dollar amounts. He does not mention specific any other locations. So we don't know the size of these, right? Again, when you're talking about property, just like in Ann Lister's time, she had Shibden Hall, which would have been valued at a certain amount, but she also had rental properties, right? That would have been valued at smaller. So in these wills, unfortunately, when you're trying to look back and sort of piece together these stories and track money, all of the details that is important aren't always there. And so that's when you have to then start really taking a deep dive into deeds and of course, more archival information, and deeds are hard to come by, especially depending on where you're looking. But so he leaves everything to his daughter that is left over after his debts are paid. And while she's the only child, he does leave the management to her inheritance to his executors until she turns 21 or gets married, whichever comes first. She turns 21 in 1781, and then she marries Dr. Belcombe, Dr. Bulcock, or well, Mr. Bulcock at the time, in 1784. So she was using whatever this inheritance was for living, education, etc., for those 12 years from the time her father died until she marries. Now, when she marries, whatever that was, again, we don't know the number. We don't know how significant it was, but whatever it was, technically, her Dr. Belcombe then would become the owner of that money, properties, etc. Now, this is early on in their marriage, right? 1784. There's a long time to go before all the children are born and they're living in York and all of that stuff. So Dr. Belcombe also, with Mrs. Belcombe, starts traveling. He goes to school. So whatever money they could have, we don't know what they spent. We don't know what their living situation was during that time when they were having the children, traveling around. He was working, going to school, etc. So we don't know how much money was involved. And we don't know how much property or its value. We just know that those 12 years passed. The other thing that we don't really know of is if there were any outside, like Marianne's family were a lot of naval officers, but there were not guaranteed pensions until the mid-19th century. At the time, during her family's working in the Navy, there was a thing called half pay, but even then it wasn't guaranteed for officers, and it was unreliable and sketchy how they determined who would get half pay. So if you've looked into Mrs. Milne, you'll see that you'll know that not every officer had a wonderfully comfortable pension, and sometimes the widows had to really fight to get that, or family members that might have been due that. So so that's her father. That's where we start out. So he left her stuff, but we don't know how much. I haven't been able to find his specific probate that includes the the pound amount. I haven't yet had the time to look into the details of any deeds, because that is a really long process. But one thing to note when you're looking at wills is copyhold freehold, and leasehold are mentioned, and all three of those mean different things for different kinds of property. So you'll see that often, but that doesn't automatically mean that somebody's going to be inheriting a giant estate. Sometimes it's a lease. Back then, if you had a lease, it went to your people that you left it to in your will. So just something to consider as you're looking. Okay, her half-brother, John Bly. So John Bly died in 1795 at the age of 60, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. This is who Marianne Mountford went to live with after her parents died. And there was a codicil in her father's will that said if she went to go live with anybody else or gave any of her inheritance to any of the other Blys, she would lose her inheritance. Now, I haven't seen anything yet that said one way or the other. So right now, it's like Schrodinger's cat. She did or she didn't at the same time lose her inheritance. But because he was married and he left whatever he did have, again, couldn't find specific pound amounts, but whatever he did have, he left everything to his wife. They also had 2 kids. And at the time of his death, she was already married and had 5 of the 6 children that the Belcombes would have. So the likelihood of a fortune coming from her guardian's wife at that time is really small. And again, thinking about the future, from this moment, a lot of years would pass before Mariana would need to rely on any possible money that was inherited. So again, it's not necessarily fair to assume that just because somebody's mentioned in a will or is related to somebody that has property or some money, that it's still going to be there when their children are grown, because not everybody was, for example, like Ann Walker with Crow Nest, an established fortune, things like that. Okay, next family member, Robert Bulcock. So this was Dr. Belcombe's brother. And from Ann's journals, we know that, and Mariana's letters, and from both of those sources, we know that Lou was living with her uncle, Robert, in Kent, and also traveling with him. So in his will is very short too, but he leaves everything to Lou and names her executor. So his probate states that he only had effects under 100 pounds. And now you'll see, this is another good example in these wills that they use general language because they don't know what's going to change over time. So in his will, he states that my leaseholds, estate lands, and tenements, and all my goods, etc., go to Lou. Well, he didn't have any leaseholds. He didn't have any of these things, but this was standard language that was put into wills to cover anything that somebody might have. So when you're looking at wills and somebody states that they leave their real estate and all of their lands, that doesn't mean they have that land unless you can actually find the deeds and the information for it. Most of that is a lot of stock language used, unless they specify, which we'll see in a minute, some examples of specification of houses. So now on to Dr. William Belcombe, right? So if we are thinking again about how if his wife was rich, he would have taken on her money. He died in November 17, 1828, buried in Scarborough, and his will is dated December 24th, 1825. So in his will, he states that if he dies first, Mrs. Belcombe inherits all of his property and personal effects, and he named her executor. So, which I thought that was great. However, if she died first, his brother, Robert Bulcock, and his business partner, Alexander Mathers, were to serve as executors. And there was a lot of instructions on what they were to do if both parents were gone and what to do for the children or grown women by that time. And if you aren't familiar with his business partner, Alexander Mathers, he and Dr. Belcombe were charged with the mistreatment of a patient named Jane Horseman, whom they were treating at Clifton. And they were found guilty and charged a fine, I think it was 50 pounds apiece. And Anne mentions this in her August 7th, 1819 entry, when she learns that they had lost their case. There is also some evidence out there that shows that Mathers and Belcombe had a falling out, but maybe not so much since he is still in his will as an executor. And also there's a little bit of evidence that shows at this time, this is the time when Dr. Belcombe's reputation starts to sort of drop in York, and he's not as prominent, which could lead to, again, this is 1820, he dies 8 years later, which maybe could have led to what he ended up leaving in his will. Again, that's just speculation. But Dr. Belcombe did die before Mrs. Belcombe, so she was awarded the Belcombe estate, quotes. You can call something an estate without it being something grand. In the event of her death first, though, he did leave £100 each to Steph and Mariana. And then for the remainder of his children, he wanted his estate to be sold, everything sold, and then the money earned from those sales to be divided between Nance, Eliza, and Louisa, or Lou. And then Eliza, at the time, she wasn't going to be married to Reverend Miller until December 10th of 1829. So she's still single. Mariana and Steph are the only two that have married at this point. I'm sorry. And Mrs. Milne was also married. But at this time, her husband was off fighting wars, and he actually died about a year and a half after this will was created in Guyana. So I think maybe Dr. Belcombe assumed that something would happen, because he also stipulates a percentage for Mrs. Milne that she had something too, which on a completely side note, Mrs. Milne's husband didn't have much to begin with. I don't think he was very good with money. So you'll see throughout the years, it looks like all of the family members were helping to take care of Mrs. Milne because they knew that her husband was not going to. In his will, he does not provide specific monetary amounts beyond that of the £100 he dedicates to Steph and Mariana. The rest is just general. Again, it's my estate. The only property he specifies in his will is his Clifton property. So he does leave that to their use, to Mrs. Belcombe's use, which she then leaves to her children. But the purpose is to keep that in the family and let all of the children that aren't married or that need it, so the four, not Mariana and Steph, divide up what they might be earning from those rents and such. And we know that Steph carried on using the Clifton house for his business later on. But you'll see that when he died in probate, he left £2,000. So this is 1825. Of course, Mariana's been married for a while. But if you're thinking early on, again, we don't know how much money he had when Mariana was a child, but knowing that he died with only £2,000 means that he either didn't have a whole lot to begin with, or it went somewhere. So when women were thinking about their future, unless they knew that their family was guaranteed wealth or had a lot of money to fall back on, and I'll use Ann Walker as an example, just because her family had so much money and owned this giant house, right? And didn't have 5 daughters to think about. So when thinking about what Mariana was, or the daughters were thinking, there was no way to guarantee that there would be enough money to live comfortably unless you were in a different situation. Now we know Dr. William Belcombe, so he owned the property where his business was, but we know he leased his house. He did not own a house in York, the house that they lived on High Petergate, which you can find more information about that on my website, Her Story in the Archives. But it was not owned by them, it was leased. So they also, didn't have like a Belcombe estate somewhere that they lived at and then came to live in York like Isabella did. So just thinking back to planning for potential futures, there was no guarantee that there would be money unless you were in certain families that had that guarantee. So next, we are going to go to Mrs. Belcombe. So she died in 1842. So that was actually a very sad year for the Belcombes, or a sad couple of years. So for Mariana, Anne dies, 1840. Her nephew ends up dying. Then her mother follows shortly behind. So a lot of deaths. But in her will, again, Dr. Belcombe left everything to her. Again, only £2,000 and 1 property. But then she turns around and then repeats his will for the children and sets it the same. So she leaves everything to her daughters that are I say unmarried, Mrs. Milne is a widow at this point. But Nance, Mrs. Milne, Lou, and they become the shared owners of the Clifton property with Steph, which he uses for his business. And she leaves all of her household goods to Nance. Nance is the executive of her will. But as you can see here in her probate, at this time, her personal effects are listed at 450 pounds. Now, imagine, we know Lou is not married at this time. Nance is not married at this time. Mrs. Milne is widowed. Eliza did marry, and Reverend Michael Miller is actually doing quite well for himself. And we know Mariana is with Charles. But again, think about 450 pounds. And Nance is the executor. That's not a whole lot to live off of if you don't have additional income. Because remember, unless you have incoming income, like Anne talks about, like, having 500 pounds a year, if that's not coming in, then that's what you have to figure out how to live off of. So as you're putting together the pieces of like what women were trying to figure out and go through, these were all of the things that anything could change. So we can see just from these basic wills that the dollar amount is, the pound amount is decreasing. The Mrs. Belcombe at the time of her death is living in another leased property. She does have one other property that also is a lease, though, that she leaves the lease to Nance as the sole her executor, and then Nance a couple years later goes ahead and signs the lease over to somebody else. So again, in those papers that I got from the archives that show that exchange of property or of leases, there's no monetary amount connected. So again, it looks, from all the wording, and there's no pound amount, it looks like it was just a sign over of a lease. So again, that wasn't something that was technically something that Nance was able to make money on. But yeah, the 450 pounds. So, and at this time also, Lou is living with her uncle. So as unmarried women, you had to find ways to figure things out. And again, if we're thinking about Mariana and what she might have been planning and her family planning, at that time, there was no guarantee that Anne Lister was going to inherit Shibden, right? Back in 1816, she did not know that for sure. And she also didn't know how much money she might have. So yes, you can run off with your, girlfriend or your wife and things. You could get lucky. You could figure out a way to live. But when you're trying to think about your forever life and the potential of what happens when women are poor or become poor, people do make decisions based on that. So going forward, we are now going to look at Mrs. Milne. So just a quick look to see. Now, assuming, right, that Mrs. Belcombe would have had lots of money from her father and family, we would have assumed that she would have passed that down, which she could have had lots of money. But as we see in people's wills, by the time it comes to their deaths where it's time to pass it on, that looks like it has disappeared. So a quick peek at Mrs. Milne's will just to see what she was dealing with, in case maybe she ended up with a huge inheritance. We see that Mrs. Milne died with effects under 450 pounds. She was living at Lawton. So as you'll see with another sister, the family did end up having to rely on Mariana. They either lived with her for a period of time, or she was also their executors. It does look like being in the situation she was in, she was able to provide for her family more than some of the other family members. So again, effects under 450 pounds at the time of her death in 1860. Again, it says here, no leaseholds. So she did not have any properties which were under lease to pass on or anything like that. And it's funny, in her will, she leaves her son, Charles Milne, 200 pounds. And she leaves his wife her wearing apparel, which I did some looking into that, and that's just a name for certain types of clothing, of course. But they were living in New Zealand at the time. Charles Carroll Milne was a settler in a New Zealand colony. And so with that 200 pounds, if she decided to ship all of her clothes, I'm going to guess that that 200 pounds disappeared quite quickly, because I can't imagine it was very cheap to ship your clothes over to New Zealand. But that's what she did. She left that. And then the will and probate both confirmed the 450 pounds. So that also is not a lot to live on when you don't have a steady income and you are trying to live some sort of life that you have been accustomed to. 450 pounds does not go a very long way when you're talking about, having ladies' maids and not having income. So next we look at Sarah Ann Sherson, also known as Nance. So we know Nance was Mrs. Belcombe's executor, and she was also the one that released the property in Scarborough that they had. And she also went to Lawton to live near Mariana. So as you can see in her probate, there was only 450 pounds. So again, if we were going back on some of the arguments I've seen before, that there was plenty of money left for all of the Belcombe children. Again, that looks like that might not be the case, as they had to go live in villages next to Mariana and Charles, and with not a whole lot of money after their belt. And in her will, she actually specifies she passed her shares of the Clifton estate to her sisters. At this time, there's like 5 dwelling houses and a yard and some things. And again, this is what Dr. Belcombe is using. And also they're renting out some of those properties. We're thinking there's smaller houses in New York, so these aren't rents that are astronomical. These are going to be rents, again, divided by those 3 sisters where they're having to share. So that might be a little bit of income, but not enough to necessarily always live your best life. She also left her personal items to her sister, Mrs. Milne, and Mariana was Nance's executor as well. So that was the money trail. You can piece together all those different pieces of information to tell a story. It does look like the pound amount dwindled over the years. Now, at this time, if we think back to who has passed away so far, so both parents have passed away. Mrs. Milne has passed away in 1860. Nance had already passed away in 1847. 1860 was a rough year for Mariana. Mrs. Milne died in January, actually on New Year's Day. Charles passed away 1 month later, and that was also the year that Mariana was technically kicked out of Lawton Hall. But when you look at that money trail, it does not lend to the idea that the Belcombes had plenty of money for all the sisters to comfortably share. Again, because there were 3 of the family members that had either married or early on or later on. So those small pound amounts that you see at the end were divided by, just a few of the sisters. So it's really hard to tell if the Belcombes had plenty of money, as we've seen in some arguments, so that none of the family had to worry. And so you can use that evidence to maybe think that, Mariana made that decision to marry just in case. Now, the one thing we will say when we do follow the money, so it did actually end up okay for Mariana. So Charles died, unfortunately, in 1860. And his will was contested a bit. There was quite a bit of drama around what he had versus what his debts were. So he died in 1860, but Mariana actually didn't see any money until 1862. And they actually went back a few times on how much money there was. And there's actually some letters where Mariana is writing to lawyers asking please, can I at least have some of the insurance money to live off of, because this is not exactly what I planned. But in the end, so Charles died February 1860. His will, the one that was finally proved, and the copy of that you see there, was dated August 5th, 1862. So quite a bit later. And in the end, Mariana received 6,056 pounds as part of her inheritance. And she was also able to take away anything from the home that she wanted that was not a family heirloom for the Lawtons. So it specifies like anything from her piano to dishware, anything like that. So she was able to take that. And so I guess one could say there was sort of a happy ending. Lou and Eliza ended up living in Belsize Park. Lou and Mariana shared a house at 7 Belsize Park. And this was an up and coming neighborhood, very expensive. Eliza and her husband lived right around the corner. So this is their house on Belsize Square. And you can actually see the back of Mariana and Lou's house right here. So they did get to spend their last years together, as some of them had previously at Lawton. And just another picture, this is the church that was literally a few houses down from their house. In fact, Eliza's house faced the church. So, and then the final sister that died was Lou in 1872, and she actually died with 21,000 pounds, which was a lot. And I'm still sort of searching, well, not sort of, but I'm still trying to follow her money trail and see where hers came from, because her uncle, although he left her money in his will, less than 100 pounds. But we do know, based on the wills, there's mention of railroad shares, etc. And so there is information out there, but it's just difficult to piece together. But that is the money trail and the Mariana marriage and no money, so to speak, story that do with as you will. And there's my contact information, Twitter, Instagram. You can also find my research that I have had the time to put up and write about on my website at herstoryinthearchives.com. I wish I had more time, because I have more content that I found, or found in various archives and locations than I've had time to transcribe or connect or write about. So if you have any questions, or if you are looking to research Mariana and the Belcombes and want to team up, let me know, because there's tons of stuff out there. And again, it's a fun puzzle to put together. Yeah, thanks for listening to all that. And I'm going to go ahead and see what sort of questions we have. Let's see, first one. Okay, I've got a little bit of time for a couple questions. Do we have a record of why he changed his name from Bulcock to Belcombe? We don't necessarily know why. We can make some assumptions, but his family originated as Bulcocks and from Lancashire, and they were not particularly well known. They were not necessarily a classy family. And in his travels, as he was, being a doctor on naval ships and hobnobbing with people, actually ended up having a friendship with the prince at the time. We can assume he wanted to make a new name for himself, and so changing it from Bulcock to Belcombe. And there's various theories about why Belcombe, but again, so there's not a hard, dead fact on why, but just based on that information, it could be, assumed that it was more so to start a new name for himself, because he was wanting to be in those sort of upper echelons that maybe his family would not have afforded him. Why was she always called Nance? Where did the name come from? Good question. I would love to know, and I've been trying to look, because in the first few years, Anne doesn't actually use the term Nance. She refers to Nance as Anne Belcombe. So yeah, I don't really know where Nance came from. And the Belcombe sisters have interesting middle names. Do these denote anything special, such as family connections? Yes, so each of the names with all of the family, even passed down to Mrs. Milne's kids and Steph's kids, they all use names connected to either family members or close friends. And you can see these names either across baptismal records. You'll see like the person named like, Sherson, you'll see that on a baptismal record for Nance and things like that. So each of the names are connected to the family or close friends at the time. And it is interesting because not all families have middle names or multiple middle names. So it's fun. It was fun finding all the connections to what their middle names were for. And then Steph and Henrietta, both their kids, they gave them all middle names too. So they just kind of passed down that naming convention. All right, I think that is all of the questions. And I think we're a little bit over. So thank you everybody for coming. And I will see you in later sessions and water closets.